I smiled when my husband told me he was leaving for a 2-year job. I even drove him to the airport. I hugged him like everything was fine. I kissed him goodbye, watched him walk toward security, and waited until he disappeared into the crowd before I turned around. Anyone watching would have thought I was just another wife trying not to cry. What they didn't know was that by the time his plane landed, he no longer had access to $420,000. And I had already filed for divorce. I didn't come to that decision overnight. Nothing about it was impulsive. If anything, the hardest part was acting like I didn't know anything at all. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 43 and I've spent the last 12 years working as an escrow officer in suburban Denver. My job is detail, numbers, paper trails, making sure people don't lose money because someone overlooked something small. Turns out that skill set transfers a little too well into your personal life. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years. No kids. A quiet house. The kind of routine most people would call stable. We weren't the couple posting anniversary tributes online, but we showed up for each other. We paid bills on time. We had dinner together more nights than not. We had plans. At least I thought we did. He told me about the job on a Tuesday night. Said his company needed someone in Chicago for a long-term project. 2 years, maybe a little less. He made it sound like an opportunity. A step up. More money, better position when he came back. I remember nodding like it made sense, because on paper it did. We talked about logistics, flights back and forth, how often he'd visit, whether I'd come out there sometimes. It all sounded reasonable, organized, temporary. That's what made it so convincing. If you had asked me that night if something felt off, I would have said no. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing stood out enough to question. There were no big fights, no dramatic changes, just small things that didn't quite line up. And small things are easy to ignore. He had been working later than usual. That happens. He kept his phone face down more often. People do that. He started taking calls in the other room. I told myself it was work. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it started to feel intentional. But even then, I didn't jump to conclusions. That's not how I operate. In my line of work, assumptions cost people money. So I waited. I watched. I paid attention. And I stopped asking questions. That part surprised me the most. I didn't confront him. I didn't push. I didn't accuse. I just listened more carefully when he talked and noticed what he didn't say. Like how the details about the job stayed vague. Like how the timeline shifted depending on the day. Like how certain conversations ended just a little too quickly. There's a moment when your instincts start connecting things before your mind is ready to accept them. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like a revelation. It feels quiet, subtle, almost easy to dismiss. That's exactly why it's dangerous. I remember standing in the kitchen one night while he was in the shower looking at his phone sitting on the counter. It wasn't locked. It wasn't hidden. It was just there. For a second, I almost picked it up, and then I didn't. Not because I trusted him completely, but because I realized something else mattered more than being right in that moment. If something was wrong, I didn't want a reaction. I wanted the truth. So I dried my hands, walked out of the kitchen, and acted like everything was still normal. That was the night I stopped being a wife who trusted her husband, and became someone who paid attention. I kept moving through our routine like nothing had changed. The next morning I made coffee the way I always did. Same mug, same amount of creamer. Daniel walked into the kitchen, checked his phone, and gave me a quick kiss like it was any other weekday. If someone had taken a picture of that moment, it would have looked like a completely normal marriage. And for a long time it was. We weren't one of those couples who needed constant excitement. No big trips every month, no dramatic gestures. We had a system that worked. Grocery runs on Sundays, bills paid on time, a shared calendar that kept everything running without much discussion. We refinanced the house 3 years ago. Sat side by side at the kitchen table, signing paperwork like two people who trusted each other with everything. Joint accounts, shared savings, no separate just-in-case funds hidden anywhere. At least not on my end. That's how confident I was in us. Daniel handled most of the long-term planning. Retirement accounts, investment choices, anything that required more patience than I had after a full day of work. I trusted him with it because he liked that kind of thing. Numbers didn't intimidate him. He actually enjoyed talking about interest rates, which I always thought was a strange personality trait. Looking back, that probably should have stood out more. But at the time, it just felt like balance. We had our roles. I handled the details in front of me. He handled the bigger picture. It made sense. It felt efficient. It felt like a partnership. There weren't any obvious cracks. No screaming matches. No doors slamming. The kind of problems people expect when something is wrong just weren't there. If anything, things had gotten quieter over the past year. Not cold, just less. Less conversation at dinner. Less random jokes. Less of those small, pointless check-ins during the day. It wasn't a sudden shift. It happened slowly enough that you could explain it away. Work stress, age, routine, all the usual excuses people use when they don't want to dig deeper. I used them too. There were nights he stayed late at the office. That wasn't new. His job had always been unpredictable. Projects ran over. Clients changed deadlines. I didn't question it because I had no reason to. At least that's what I told myself. He started traveling more. Short trips at first. A couple of days here and there. Always with a reasonable explanation. Meetings, site visits. Things I couldn't really verify without going out of my way to do it. And I didn't go out of my way. Because normal marriages don't require verification. That's the lie people believe. We kept doing what we always did. Ate dinner together when he was home. Watched the same shows. Talked about things that didn't matter enough to cause problems. The house stayed quiet. Predictable. Safe. If you had asked me then if I was happy, I would have said yes. Not excited, not deeply fulfilled, but stable. And stability has a way of convincing you that everything is fine. It lowers your guard. There's something about a routine that makes you stop looking for change. You assume that if something big was wrong, it would show up in a big way. A fight. A confession. Something obvious. But that's not how it works most of the time. Most of the time, it hides inside the ordinary. I remember one evening sitting across from him at the table while he scrolled through his phone, barely touching his food. I asked him how his day was. He gave me a short answer. Nothing unusual about that. Except I realized I couldn't remember the last time he told me anything specific. Not about work. Not about people. Not about anything that actually required him to think before answering. Everything had become surface level. And I let it stay that way, because pushing for more felt unnecessary, even a little dramatic. We weren't fighting. We weren't disconnected in any obvious way. We were just coexisting. That word didn't bother me then. It should have. The version of our marriage I believed in was built on consistency, predictable behavior, shared responsibility, mutual trust, all the things that look solid from the outside. And maybe at one point they were. But somewhere along the way, consistency turned into distance, and I didn't notice when the line got crossed. Or maybe I noticed and chose not to label it. Because once you name something, you have to deal with it. And at that point, I still thought what we had was something worth protecting. Even if I didn't fully understand what it had already turned into. I started noticing patterns once I stopped expecting explanations. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. No lipstick on a collar. No late-night confessions. Just small changes that didn't match the version of Daniel I had known for over a decade. He became more careful with his phone. Not secretive in an obvious way. Just deliberate. Screen always facing down. Notifications silenced more often than before. If a message came in while we were sitting together, he'd glance at it quickly, then shift the conversation like nothing happened. I told myself it was work. That excuse covered a lot. Then there were the calls. He started stepping into the other room more frequently. Again, not unusual on its own. People take work calls, but the tone changed. Shorter sentences, lower voice, conversations that ended the second I got too close. At one point, I walked into the living room while he was on the phone. He looked at me, paused, and said, "I'll call you back." No name, no explanation. That stuck with me longer than it should have. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and went back to the kitchen like it didn't matter, because at that point I was still trying to prove to myself that it didn't. The financial side started shifting too, but in ways that were easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Small charges at places we didn't usually go. Restaurants I had never heard of. A hotel charge that showed up midweek when he was supposedly working late. I noticed it while reviewing our joint account one evening. Not because I was suspicious, but because I check numbers out of habit. It's part of my job. Patterns stand out to me whether I'm looking for them or not. I hovered over the transaction longer than necessary. Then I closed the app. Because there was always a reasonable explanation if you wanted one badly enough. Maybe it was a client dinner. Maybe the hotel was for a last-minute work situation. Maybe I was connecting dots that didn't belong together. That's the thing about doubt. It doesn't come in as certainty. It comes in as questions you don't feel justified asking yet. So I waited. But I also started watching more closely. His schedule became harder to follow. He'd mention meetings that didn't show up on his shared calendar. Trips that came together last minute but somehow fit neatly into his routine. Stories that sounded complete but not detailed. That's what stood out the most. The lack of detail. When someone tells the truth, they don't have to think about how much to include. When someone is managing information, every sentence is measured. I started hearing the difference. One night he told me he'd be working late again. Same tone, same casual delivery. I nodded, said okay, and went back to what I was doing. But instead of letting it go, I checked our account again later that evening. There was a charge at a restaurant across town. Not near his office. Not near anywhere he had ever mentioned going for work. I sat there staring at the screen doing the mental math without even realizing it. Time, location, distance. None of it lined up. For the first time, I didn't look for an excuse. I just let the inconsistency exist. And once you allow one inconsistency to stand on its own, others start lining up next to it. The late nights. The phone behavior. The vague explanations. The random charges. Individually, they were easy to dismiss. Together, they started forming something I couldn't ignore anymore. I still didn't confront him. That would have been the obvious move. Ask questions, push for answers, demand clarity. But I knew how that would go. He'd explain it, smoothly, calmly, in a way that made me sound like I was overreacting. And without proof, I'd have nothing to stand on except a feeling. Feelings don't hold up well in arguments. Facts do. So I made a decision that felt small at the time, but changed everything after. I stopped trying to understand what he was telling me, and started paying attention to what he wasn't. I waited until he fell asleep before I touched his laptop. It wasn't locked. Daniel never felt the need to lock things at home. That used to feel like trust. Now it felt like overconfidence. I opened it slowly, more out of habit than fear. The screen lit up, and for a second I just stared at the desktop like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Then I reminded myself why I was there. I didn't start digging through everything. I kept it simple. Email first. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Work threads, promotions, random subscriptions he never unsubscribed from. Nothing that would raise a red flag on its own. Then I saw her name. Emily. It wasn't saved in any special way. No hearts, no obvious signs, just a normal contact buried between dozens of others. If I hadn't been paying attention, I would have missed it. But the frequency stood out. Emails back and forth. Not dozens a day. Just enough to stay consistent. The kind of pattern that looks casual unless you stop and look at it closely. I clicked on one. The tone wasn't professional. It wasn't explicit either. That's what made it worse. It read like two people trying to sound normal while saying things that weren't normal at all. Can't wait to see you again. Last weekend wasn't enough. Next time longer. No mention of work. No shared project. No reason for them to be talking at all, let alone like that. I didn't scroll fast. I read everything carefully. Dates times small details that most people would skip. That's how you build a timeline. That's how you separate a suspicion from something you can actually prove. Chicago showed up more than once, not as a job location, as a meeting point. There were references to an apartment. Casual mentions like it was already understood between them. No explanation needed because both of them knew exactly what it meant. I leaned back in the chair and let that sink in. The job. Chicago. It wasn't a coincidence. I kept going. I checked his browser history next. Not everything just recent activity. Property listings, short-term rentals, a couple of saved pages for apartments in downtown Chicago. That confirmed it. He hadn't just been visiting. He had been setting something up. I moved on to his saved documents. Most of it was work-related, but one folder caught my attention. It wasn't hidden, just labeled in a way that didn't draw attention. Inside were PDFs, lease agreements, email confirmations, payment receipts. He had signed a lease 3 months ago. 3 months. While we were still sitting at the same dinner table talking about grocery lists and weekend plans, he was securing a place to live with someone else. I didn't feel shocked. That part was already there, just waiting for confirmation. What I felt instead was clarity. Everything that didn't make sense before suddenly lined up perfectly. The late nights, the trips, the vague conversations, the way he had presented the job like it was something we were both adjusting to. It wasn't an adjustment, it was an exit plan, and he had been working on it for months. I closed the laptop without making any changes. No deleted files. No opened messages left unread. I wasn't there to confront him. I was there to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and I had my answer. But I wasn't done. Information is only useful if you know how to use it. The next day I ran a credit check. Not something most people think to do in a situation like this, but I wasn't approaching it emotionally anymore. I was looking at it the same way I would any financial risk. That's when I saw the line of credit. A HELOC tied to our house. Opened recently. The balance wasn't small. I stared at the number longer than I had at anything else so far. Because that wasn't just betrayal. That was exposure. He wasn't just building a life somewhere else. He was using ours to fund it. I printed everything and put it in a folder like it was just another file from work. Once I had something concrete, I stopped reacting to what I felt and focused on what I could prove. Dates, transactions, emails, documents. If it didn't leave a record, it didn't matter. The timeline came together faster than I expected. Emily wasn't new. She had been in the picture for at least 14 months. That meant this started long before the job opportunity ever came up. Long before the late nights became routine. Long before I even had a reason to question anything. It overlapped with everything I thought was normal. Birthdays, holidays, weekends where he told me he had work deadlines. There were entire stretches of time where I thought we were just living our lives, and he was somewhere else building a second one. Chicago wasn't random either. It was consistent. Flights booked under his name, sometimes last minute, sometimes planned weeks ahead. Hotels at first. Then nothing for a while, which made sense once I saw the lease agreement. After that, there were fewer hotel charges because he didn't need them anymore. He had a place. I cross-checked the dates from his emails with the transactions. Restaurant charges lined up with nights he told me he was working late. Ride shares in areas he had no professional reason to be in. Small purchases that didn't mean anything until you placed them next to everything else. Individually, they were forgettable. Together, they told the whole story. Emily believed something very different from what I had been told. That part surprised me more than I expected. From the tone of her messages, she thought he was already on his way out of the marriage. Not immediately, it's soon. There were references to when everything is settled and once it's official. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Which meant he wasn't just lying to me. He was managing two completely different versions of the same reality. I read one message 3 times before I moved on. 2 years isn't that long. We'll finally have our own space. That was the job. That was the timeline. He had framed it as temporary for me and permanent for her. I closed the folder and sat there for a minute, letting that settle in. Not because I needed time to process the betrayal. That part was already clear. What I needed was to understand the structure of what he had built. Because that determines how you take it apart. He wasn't planning to disappear completely. He was planning to stay connected just enough to maintain control. Shared finances, joint accounts, a house still in both our names. From a distance, everything would look intact, which meant he could keep access. That was the part he underestimated. I logged into our main account later that evening and reviewed everything again, this time with a different focus. Not what had already happened, but what was still possible. Balances, transfer limits, linked accounts, timing. There was more than enough there to matter, and it was all still within reach. He hadn't separated anything yet. No new accounts under a different structure. No attempts to move funds quietly over time. He was still operating like nothing needed to change on that front. That told me everything I needed to know about how confident he was. Confident people don't rush. They assume they have time. I checked the HELOC details again. The draw amounts matched the timeline of his trips. Rent payments, furnishing expenses. He wasn't just visiting Chicago. He was setting up a full living situation, using money tied to both of us. That changed the situation from personal to financial. And financial problems don't get solved with conversations. They get handled with strategy. I didn't confront him when he came home that night. I didn't bring up Chicago. I didn't ask about Emily. I asked him how his day was, listened to the same surface-level answer, and nodded like it was enough. Because at that point, I wasn't looking for honesty from him anymore. I was making decisions based on what I already knew. I stopped asking questions and started setting things in order. The first call I made wasn't to a friend. It wasn't to family. It was to an attorney. I didn't need someone to comfort me. I needed someone who understood how this would actually play out in Colorado. What mattered, what didn't, what I could do now versus what would come back to hurt me later. Her name was Rachel, mid-50s, direct, no unnecessary commentary. Exactly the kind of person you want when emotions are involved and mistakes are expensive. I didn't tell her a story. I gave her facts: marriage length, joint assets, the house, the HELOC, the account balances, the emails, the lease in Chicago, the timeline of the affair. She didn't react to the cheating. She focused on the money. That line of credit is tied to both of you, she said, which means anything he's drawn affects you directly. That part I already understood. What I needed was the next step. Do not confront him, she added. Not yet. That confirmed what I had already decided. Confrontation sounds satisfying in theory. In reality, it gives the other person time to adjust. Move money. Close accounts. Rewrite the situation before anything legal is in place. I wasn't interested in giving him that advantage. We went through options. What could be documented? What needed to be secured? What actions would hold up if this ended up in court? Everything had to be clean, traceable, defensible. That's the word she kept coming back to. Defensible. Because intent matters less than what you can prove. I started organizing everything that night. Not dramatically, not in a way that would raise questions. Just quietly pulling together what already existed: bank statements, account numbers, copies of the HELOC activity, screenshots of emails, dates matched with transactions, a full picture that didn't rely on memory. I kept it all in a folder that looked like work. That part was easy. What took more control was how I acted around him. Nothing changed on the surface. We still had dinner together. Still talked about the same small things. Still moved through the same routine. If anything, I made an effort to be more normal, not less. No tension. No distance. No signs that anything had shifted. Because the moment he sensed a problem, he'd start protecting himself. And right now, he wasn't protecting anything. He mentioned Chicago more often as the departure got closer. Details about the project. Timelines. Logistics. All of it delivered in that same controlled way I had already learned to recognize. I nodded through all of it. Not because I believed him, because I needed him to believe me. Rachel advised me to look closely at timing. Not just emotionally, but financially. When funds were available, when transfers would clear, what actions could be taken without triggering immediate alerts or holds. There's a window in situations like this, a point where everything is still accessible but about to change. Miss it, and you spend months trying to recover what should have been protected in the first place. I wasn't going to miss it. I reviewed our accounts daily, not obsessively, just consistently enough to know exactly where everything stood. Balances didn't fluctuate much. He wasn't moving money in large amounts. Not yet. Again, confidence. He thought the plan was under control. He thought the timeline worked in his favor. That gave me something most people don't get in this situation. Time to act before the damage was final. The last step was simple on paper and complicated in execution. Wait until he left. Not emotionally. Logistically. Once he was out of state, the situation shifted. Distance changes response time. It limits what someone can do immediately. It buys space. That's all I needed. The morning of his flight, everything felt exactly the way it had been presented. Routine. Organized. Temporary. He packed his bags. Double-checked his documents. Ran through the same details we had already discussed. Flights. Arrival time. First week schedule. I drove him to the airport without saying anything that didn't match the version of events he believed in. Because at that point, saying less wasn't just easier. It was necessary. I waited until his flight status changed to departed before I opened my laptop. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just a checklist I had already gone over enough times to know exactly what to do. First, the transfers. I logged into our joint account and moved the money in controlled amounts, not one large transaction. That matters. Large transfers trigger reviews, delays questions. Smaller ones move faster, especially when they stay within established limits. It wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. By the time I was done, $420,000 had been moved into an account he couldn't access. Same bank, same name on the account, but different structure. One he wasn't listed on. Everything was documented. Time-stamped, clean. Next, I secured access. Passwords changed. Not randomly, but across every account tied to our finances. Banking credit lines, anything that could be used to move money or open new obligations. I enabled two-factor authentication where it wasn't already active. Then I called the bank. Not to report fraud. That would have complicated things. I flagged the account for unusual activity review and added internal notes tied to my identity verification. Enough to slow down any immediate attempts to reverse transactions without creating a false claim. Again controlled. Then I called Rachel. "It's done," I said. She didn't ask for details. She moved straight to the next step. File today. Colorado allows for no-fault divorce, but filing with supporting documentation changes the tone of the case. It establishes position early. It frames the narrative before the other side has time to adjust. I drove to her office with the folder I had been building for weeks. Everything was there. Marriage records, financial statements, the HELOC activity, copies of the lease, email excerpts that showed the relationship clearly without turning it into something dramatic. Facts. We filed that afternoon. Officially. No announcement, no message, no warning. By the time his plane landed in Chicago, the paperwork was already in the system. That's when my phone started ringing. First call, I let it go. Second call, same. By the third, I knew he had seen something. Either an account alert, a login failure, or the first legal notification starting to process. I answered on the fourth. Laura. His voice wasn't calm anymore. What's going on with the account? Straight to the point. No small talk. No checking in. Just the thing that affected him. I moved the money, I said. Silence. Then, why would you do that? Not what happened. Not confusion about the situation. Just why I acted. That told me everything about where his priorities were. You should talk to your attorney, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. What are you talking about? The divorce filing, I said. You'll be served. There's a moment when someone realizes they're not in control anymore. You can hear it. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's a shift in how they respond. This was that moment. You filed for divorce, he asked, like the idea didn't make sense. Yes. For what reason? That question almost made me laugh. But I kept my tone flat. You already know the answer to that. He didn't argue. Not right away. He moved into explanation mode. Talking faster. Trying to reframe things before I said anything else. It's not what you think, he said. You're overreacting. We can talk about this. I didn't interrupt him, because there was nothing he could say at that point that would change anything I had already done. When he finished, I kept it simple. I'm not discussing this over the phone. Then I hung up. The calls kept coming after that. Messages, emails, different tones. Confusion first, then frustration. Then attempts to sound reasonable again. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to negotiate informally. Everything that mattered was already in motion. By the next day, he had been formally notified. And for the first time since this started, the situation wasn't something he could manage privately anymore. It existed on record, with dates, with numbers, with proof. I changed the locks a week later. Not out of anger, just procedure. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a heavy way. More like everything unnecessary had finally cleared out. I didn't rush to redecorate or make big changes. I kept things simple. Same furniture, same routine. Just without the constant background noise of trying to figure someone out. People assume there's a big emotional release after something like this. That you feel relief or victory or even regret. I didn't feel any of those right away. What I felt was steady, clear. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't second-guessing anything. There were no mixed signals to interpret, no small inconsistencies to explain away. Everything was exactly what it was, and that made life a lot easier to manage. Daniel tried to reach out a few more times through attorneys. Nothing dramatic. Just attempts to negotiate to reframe the situation in a way that worked better for him. But the structure was already in place. The documentation didn't change. The timeline didn't change. Facts don't adjust themselves to make people more comfortable. Emily contacted me once. Short message. No hostility. Just confusion. She had figured out that the version of reality she was given didn't match the one I was living in. I didn't respond. Not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing useful to say. We were both dealing with the same person, just from different angles. The legal process moved forward the way Rachel said it would. Slow in some areas, faster in others. But controlled. Predictable. That's what matters. I kept working. Same job, same schedule. The only difference was that I paid closer attention to everything tied to my name. Accounts, documents, decisions. Not out of fear, just out of awareness. That's probably the biggest lesson in all of this. Pay attention before you have to. Most people don't think about financial structure in a marriage until something goes wrong. They trust the system because it feels easier. Joint accounts, shared access, no questions asked. It works until it doesn't. If I could give one piece of advice, it wouldn't be about relationships. It would be about information. Know where your money is. Know how it moves. Know what's tied to your name, even if you trust the person you're with. Especially then. Trust doesn't replace awareness. And awareness doesn't mean you're expecting something bad to happen. It just means you won't be caught off guard if it does. The other lesson is simpler. When something feels off, don't rush to prove yourself wrong. That instinct to dismiss your own judgment. It costs more than people realize. You don't have to jump to conclusions, but you also don't have to ignore patterns just because they're inconvenient. Give yourself time to observe. That's where clarity comes from. Looking back, I don't see this as revenge. I didn't set out to hurt him. I didn't need to. I just made sure I wasn't the one getting hurt any further. There's a difference, and it matters. If anything, this falls somewhere in between what people would call family drama and real life. The kind of situation that doesn't look extreme on the surface but has real consequences underneath. And maybe that's why stories like this resonate. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're possible. If you're into family revenge stories that rely more on strategy than emotion, or real family drama that actually reflects how these situations unfold in real life, you're going to find more of that here. Just honest situations handled carefully. So if that's the kind of story you want to hear more of, you can subscribe to the channel. No pressure. Just more stories told the way they actually happen. I didn't win anything in the end. I just stopped losing. And sometimes that's the only outcome that matters.